Chapter 23. Patria. 609 Ab Urbe Condita, 145 BC. The share beam was oak, the plough beam holm oak, and the poles and stilt were made of elm. Paulus was ploughing the top field, the one over the crest on the far side of the Sabotus. As the field was on a hillside, he drew the plough across the slope, with the share alternately pointing uphill and down. The furrows ran smooth and straight. Their ordered rows reminded him of the files of the Achaean phalanx at the Isthmus, before the latter had collapsed in mortal panic. The memory did not trouble him. It was better to think of the battle than what came after. The metal blade of the share caught on a thick root, and he halted the oxen. They were a new pair, 9-year-olds, in their prime. They were accustomed to the yoke and to each other. They would not fight in the furrow. Paulus had not wanted to spend the money. It was not parsimony, but a reluctance to give credence to the rumours about his hidden wealth. After the unsettling conversation with Fidubius and Vibius at the hunting party, he was very sensitive to the stories that he had brought a fortune back from Corinth. Paulus took down the billhook from where it hung on the stilt. Bending to the work, laboriously he sliced through the tough root. Twice he had to stop with a fit of coughing. The fever had come on him after the hunt. It had lasted only 4 days, but had left a persistent racking cough. Finally, the task was done. It was worth the effort. Better he work up a sweat than tear the root out with the plough and risk either breaking the share or straining the oxen. Rehanging the billhook, he stood and stretched his aching back. There was a bitter wind. It blew over the crest, down the wild rocky cliff, through the olives and vines, and then out across the open ploughland. It was cold enough to flay an ox. Paulus rubbed his hands together. His cloak and sword belt would have got in the way, and he had left them with his lunch by the water trough at the lower side of the field. In this weather, it was better to be moving. He gathered the whip and reins, and stirred the beasts back into motion. Paulus cast a lonely figure as he plodded behind the team, crossing and recrossing the windswept hillside. Pastor had driven the flock down from the Scylla, ready for the winter, and Paulus had left Eutyches with the shepherd to settle the sheep into their sheds. Paulus had wanted to be on his own. The eternal rhythm of ploughing, the rich clay smell of the turned soil, helped him think. Perhaps it was the lingering illness that had made him more taciturn than usual with Minardo the previous evening, but he had much on his mind. 4 or 5 nights ago there had been an intruder on the farm. Paulus had been the last to leave the barn, and the first there in the morning. He had noticed at once that some of the implements were not exactly where he had left them. Nothing had been stolen, but someone had been there. Paulus had questioned Eutyches and Pastor. They said they had not stirred from the slave quarters all night. There was no reason to disbelieve them. A stranger had crept into the farmyard. It was strange that Niger had not barked, but the hound was getting old, and he slept a great deal. 2 mornings later, the theta charm had been missing from his belt. It had been hanging with his armour by the fireplace. His mother had accused the new maid. The girl had denied the theft. The ornament was copper. It had no value. Of course, it could have been lost the day before, fallen off somewhere in the fields, but Paulus was certain that he would have noticed when he took off the belt. From then on, Paulus had locked the farmhouse door at night. And then last night the kindly ones had returned. There had been no hint of their presence since the Temple of the Hero. Paulus had dared to hope that saving Minardo had been some sort of redemption. That fragile optimism had been shattered when he awoke to hear their rasping breath and smell their foul corpse odour. All 3 sisters had been standing in the dark at the foot of the bed. The old women did not speak to him, but murmured to each other. Their words were inaudible, but their demeanour was that of a jury considering the verdict. "The past cannot be undone," Paulus had said. "What happened in Corinth was not my fault. I did not wish it to happen. I should not be cursed." They had not replied, but regarded him with deliberation, and then they were gone. Paulus pulled the oxen to a stop and cleaned the share with a stick tipped with a scraper. Sometimes he wondered if it was all in his mind. If what he had done in the last house in Corinth had permanently unhinged some delicate mechanism that ordered his perceptions, he would not be the first man driven mad by guilt. Hercules had locked himself in a dark room, shunning all contact with humanity after he had flung his own children into the fire. Alexander had tried to starve himself to death when he had drunkenly murdered his friend. Paulus checked the oxen were yoked as tightly as possible. It kept their heads up and prevented their necks getting chafed. The Macedonian army had begged Alexander to eat and drink, to preserve himself for them. Hercules had been told the road to redemption by the Delphic oracle. No deity or army was going to intervene for Paulus. Deliverance could only come from within. The team was nearing the plantation. Wheat would be sown between the rows of olive trees. Paulus fitted the oxen with muzzles of soft basketry to stop them nibbling the leaves. Deliverance could only come from admitting what he had done. Paulus cracked the whip above their heads, and the great strength of the oxen took the strain. As the plough got moving, Paulus doubled up, coughing. It saved his life. The arrow hissed through the air where his neck had been. It was close enough to feel the wind of its passing. Instinctively, Paulus threw himself to the right. He rolled, then scrambled to his feet, getting the team between him and his assailant. Leaning against the broad shoulder of the near ox, he was paralyzed with shock. Someone was trying to kill him. Not in Corinth, but here in his own field. Not a foreigner, but one of his own fellow townsmen. Someone he must know was trying to kill him. The thing was incredible. Think, you fool. Think or you're dead. Paulus risked a peek around the beast's head. The arrow had come from down the slope, from somewhere near where he had left his belongings. He saw movement behind the dry stone boundary wall of the field. Stay here and the bowman will shift his position. Easy enough to work round the edge of the field, get a clear shot and pick him off. The plantation was only some 30 paces off uphill. Paulus set off. He ran as fast as he could, trying to keep the oxen between him and the archer. 20 paces to the safety of the olives and vines. Another arrow, this time from ahead and off to the left. It seemed to accelerate as it closed. Paulus threw himself down. Stones grazed his arms. Mud splattered his face. Before his mind had accepted that the shaft had missed, he was up again. Now he angled to the right. It took him away from the lee of the oxen. Both bowmen could take a shot. He jinked and sidestepped, to the left, then to the right, then to the right again, anything to throw off their aim, to avoid a predictable pattern. He heard, rather than saw, another arrow. It thrummed behind his back. Another whipped past his face. 10 paces to the tree line. The damp earth was pulling at his feet, weighing down his boots. Paulus felt his luck running out. He dived forward, hit the ground, rolled, then scrabbled like an animal on all fours into the plantation. The olives were in widely spaced rows. The vine trellises ran between their trunks. They made it hard to see up the slope, but looking from side to side there was nothing but lanes of bare earth waiting to be ploughed between the trees. Paulus crashed through the first row of vines, snapping the thin poles, trampling the tender plants. He dashed across the open space and burst through the next line. They could track his progress by the noise, but that was less important than getting deep into the trees. 7 or 8 rows in, he risked turning and running down the avenue between the trees. He ran for 40 paces, then worked his way quietly through the next trellis uphill. Panting, he cowered against the silvery trunk of an ancient olive. He turned and peered back down through the foliage to the ploughed land. The oxen stood passively, untroubled by this human activity that meant nothing to them. Then Paulus glimpsed what he had expected. The first archer was crossing the field. A slight figure in a dark tunic, limbs blackened, face disguised by the mask of a wolf. Bow in hand, arrow nocked, he was scanning the plantation, but moved confidently, without hurry. There was something familiar about his gait, but there was no time to dwell on that. The other bowman now would be somewhere off to Paulus's right. He would be sneaking up through the trees, seeking to finish what they had started. This was the time for Paulus to act, while the 2 men were separated. Ghost up to the one in the plantation, turn the hunter into the hunted, get in close so he could not use the bow and kill him. It did not have to be done quietly. Once he was dead, Paulus would have his bow. If the slender figure in the field did not flee, Paulus could shoot him down. But Paulus had no weapon. Not even a knife. That was on his belt with his sword. The billhook! Hades, he was a fool. He had forgotten the billhook. It was still hanging on the stilt of the plough. If he could not fight, then he must hide. This was no good. In a forest he could have concealed himself, but not in the ordered lanes of this plantation. All the second bowman had to do was move upslope, carefully checking each open avenue, and sooner or later he would run his quarry to earth. There was nowhere to hide among the olives, and above was only the cliff. Dotted with wild junipers and brambles, it offered no cover. The hopelessness of utter despair. There was nothing he could do. The brambles! Of course! The brambles on the rock face above that screened his childhood hiding place. All he had to do was reach the tiny cave unseen. No one else knew it was there. Now Paulus went with more caution. The cave was uphill and to the right. Thank the gods it was away from the bowmen already scouring the plantation. Paulus scurried down each avenue until he spotted a gap in the vines where he could crawl through without making a sound. His ascent was noiseless, but painfully slow. A rising tide of panic urged him to haste. At any moment the point of an arrowhead might punch into his defenceless back. Fighting down the fear, he continued his stealthy progress. Eventually, it seemed an age, he reached the final line of trees. He had come out where he intended. There, not 20 paces away at the foot of the cliff, were the bushes that obscured the entrance to the cave. The incline to them was not steep, but it was completely bare, and there were loose stones. Paulus hesitated in an agony of indecision. Cross the exposed rock fast and risk being heard, or slowly, increasing the chance of being seen. Somewhere close behind, a branch snapped. Paulus went up fast, but watching where he placed his feet. There was no cry of alarm. The gap between the brambles and the rock was narrower than Paulus remembered. The bushes had grown, or he was bigger. He used an arm to sweep back the wiry branches, ignoring the barbs tearing his skin. Sideways, he forced himself through, shielding his face with his other arm. And there was the entrance. It was only half as wide again as his shoulders. He wriggled into the dark. The floor of the little cave ran upwards. It stretched no more than 8 feet into the cliff. There was no room to turn round. Paulus wedged himself as far in as possible, drew up his legs. There was nothing to do but wait. There was no point in praying. The gods did not listen to men like him. The odds against some neighbouring farmer coming to this remote place were enormous. Once his eyes became accustomed to the gloom, and his body was blocking most of the light, he looked with wonder on the small relics left from his childhood. His name scratched in the wall, the letters lighter than the rest of the rock. A small, crudely carved toy soldier. He had whittled it himself, an image of the man he had always wanted to become. He had become that man, and it had brought him wealth, but nothing else that was good. And now he was reduced again to hiding in the dark, like the child he had once been. Except now he was hiding from much worse than his father's disapproval and the lash of his belt. There was no way out of here. If they found him, he would be dragged out feet first and butchered. Paulus heard the stones sliding out from under boots. Each step produced a small cascade. They were getting closer. Had they seen his furtive scurry up to the cave? The footsteps were very loud, the chink and scrape of each pebble audible. Paulus stilled his breathing. The footsteps stopped by the bushes. The scratches on Paulus's arm were stinging. Oh, dear gods, was there blood on the brambles? Would they see? Moving inch by inch, Paulus craned his neck and looked down over his huddled body. In the sunlight beyond the undergrowth, he could see a pair of boots. The man was standing right there. The boots were solid, workmanlike, the boots of a countryman. The figure was so close Paulus could smell him. The feral reek of the pelt of a wolf, human sweat, and something sweeter, cinnamon or spikenard. Suddenly Paulus felt the tickling in his throat, the desperate need to cough. He tried to swallow. The sensation was worse. He buried his face in his arm, breathed very shallowly through his nose. At any moment he would lose the unequal fight. And, like a miracle, the boots moved off. Coughing forgotten, Paulus lay in his lair and listened to the receding crunch of the footsteps. After a time they were gone, but there was still nothing to be done except wait.